We are talking today about the dramatic life story of one of the world's most famous campaigner for peace, Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King Jr. was born in 1929 in the southern states of USA. He first learned about the importance of skin color when he was 5 years old, and he could not go to the same school as his white friend. King's grandfather, King's father were both preachers, and religion was very important in his early life. He graduated as a preacher in 1955. He settled in Montgomery, Alabama, to help the poor black people there, where he became president of the MIEA, Montgomery Improvement Association, a black organization against segregation. He was, of course, influenced by the teaching of Mahatma Gandhi. 1955, we should remember Montgomery bus boycott. Rosa Parks, an African American, refused to give her seat on a bus to a white passenger. She was arrested. Martin Luther King, the organization, and others began to boycott the city buses. And this lasted 1 year. And in the end, in 1956, the US government made segregation on buses illegal. King began to teach nonviolent resistance to his followers. He traveled to Africa, started making speeches all over America, and fought to stop segregation in school. Violent acts were committed against African Americans, and politicians were divided about segregation. In 1960, he joined one of these protests, was imprisoned. JFK, who was running for president, offered to help him. The President Kennedy supported King and began to draw up the Civil Rights Bill. One of the most important moments is in 1963, when more than 250,000 people listened as Martin Luther King gave one of the most famous speeches in American history. He spoke of his dream that one day black and white children will be sisters and brothers. He was the last speaker to address the marchers, and he delivered the most famous speech of his career. He was impassioned, rhythmic, and clear. And of course, he described his hopes for the future. In 1964, he was awarded the Nobel Prize. In 1965, he was arrested in Selma, Alabama. It was a great news in newspapers and also television broadcast about this action. More protest marches and more violence followed. Finally, President Johnson signed a new voting right law as King and Rosa Parks stood beside him, as you can see in the picture. Let's arrive to the end of his life. In 1968, King made his last speech in front of an audience in Memphis, Tennessee. The next evening, a sniper shot King as he stood on a balcony of a motel room. His death caused national outrage, shock, and sorrow, and triggered riots all over USA. And if you have the chance, I really suggest you should watch the video in which Robert Kennedy is announcing Martin Luther King's death in Indianapolis. There is also a day, which is usually the third Monday in January, where Americans celebrate African American history and remember King and his message of equality. King was really dedicated to his cause. Even though he was married, he really thought that his life was just the fight for the rights. The cause of civil rights for African Americans was so big, and his campaign made it so active that he could never rest. He lived a very public life in front of the world's press. Other protest leaders who have given up their lives to their cause include Mahatma Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, and Aung San Suu Kyi in Burma. Nonviolence was the central theme in Martin Luther King's life, and his campaign brought huge publicity, and because King taught blacks to meet the whites with love, not hate. He wanted to reach all the poor black people to show them that their lives could be better. He made speeches all over America and he held meetings, and every time he was arrested, it made world news. Of course, racism was a big issue, and he wanted to fight against the belief that one race was more important than the others, and many whites today still believe they are superior to blacks in many parts of the world. Racism exists in more or less extreme forms in most cultures and is one of the most oppressing issues in world politics today. We are going now to analyze Martin Luther King's famous speech, I Have a Dream, which he delivered on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. on the 28th of August in 1963. We are going to use the help of this visual image, and the semantic area is referring to is the one of commerce and finance, to point out that the black have gathered to cash a check. But the check is a bad check. It means that it has insufficient funds. Martin Luther King refuses to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. So he says that it is time to rise from the dark segregation to lift the nation from racial injustice to brotherhood. So from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice, and from the quicksand of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. But to do this, there is a struggle to face, and he says that people shouldn't underestimate the determination of the Negroes. He calls for non-violent struggle, for creative protest conducted on the plane of dignity and discipline. So he urges the nation not to underestimate this determination of the Negro. So he really would like to fight with this dignity and discipline for freedom. And he's also looking forward to finding a nation where there is a symphony of brotherhood, where from the mountain of despair there will be a stone of hope. And he is fighting for the citizenship rights of the black people. And he repeats many times, I have a dream. And he says, and it is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. And he says that he really hopes that one day all men will be the same. And he's then giving some examples of southern states, for example Georgia, and he says he will be really happy when the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. And then he quotes Mississippi, called a desert state, in which there will be an oasis of freedom and justice. And he says that in his vision of the future, his 4 children will one day live in a nation where they will be not judged by the color of the skin, but by the content of their character. He goes on also referring to Alabama, and he says where black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. So, arriving to the end of the speech, he repeats this sentence: "Let freedom ring." And when freedom rings, when this happens, everyone will join their hands, saying, "Free at last." Free at last. And he closes the speech saying, "Thank God Almighty, we are freed at last."